I always thought we were solid. My wife, Emily, and I had been married for 7 years, and though our marriage wasn't without its challenges, I never doubted the foundation we built. We had a life that looked ideal from the outside, a cozy home in the suburbs, steady jobs, and a circle of close-knit friends. My brother, Mike, was practically my best friend, which made me feel like I had hit the jackpot when it came to family. Emily had always been a force of nature, ambitious, sharp-tongued, and confident in every aspect of her life. Her wit and energy had drawn me to her the moment we met, and I'd be lying if I said I hadn't felt lucky every day since. Lately, though, things had felt off. It wasn't one thing, but a dozen little ones. She seemed more distant, always busy with something or someone, and her laughter didn't seem to come as easily when she was with me. One Thursday evening, as I sat in our living room flipping through TV channels, Emily came down the stairs wearing a fitted black dress. She looked stunning, as always, but I wasn't prepared for the knot in my stomach when she told me she had plans to meet up with a few friends from her old job. It wasn't the first time she'd gone out without me, far from it, but something about the way she avoided my eyes as she kissed me goodbye stuck with me. "I won't be too late," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Don't wait up." "Okay," I said, trying not to let my voice betray the unease settling in my chest. "Have fun." As the door clicked shut, I leaned back against the couch and exhaled. Maybe it was just my imagination, I told myself. Marriage wasn't easy, especially when both people had demanding jobs. Emily had been putting in extra hours at her law firm, and I'd been caught up with my work as a construction foreman. Maybe we just needed to reconnect. Over the next few weeks, though, the distance between us grew. Emily started dressing up more often, claiming she had networking events or girls' nights. She'd return home late, her makeup still flawless, and head straight to the shower before slipping into bed. Our conversations became surface level, punctuated by her quick retorts and dismissals whenever I tried to dig deeper. The worst part was that I couldn't even pinpoint when things had changed. Was it months ago? A year? Had I been too caught up in my own life to notice the cracks forming in our marriage? One night, as I scrolled through my phone, a photo popped up on social media, a group picture from a party I hadn't even known Emily had attended. My heart stopped when I saw her standing next to Mike, my brother, both of them grinning like teenagers. She had her arm around his shoulder, her body pressed against his in a way that made my stomach churn. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Mike and Emily had always been close, too close, maybe, but I'd never worried about it before. He was my brother, and I trusted him implicitly. Besides, Emily had always been touchy-feely with everyone. That was just her nature, right? But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were starting to take root. The real gut punch came a week later when I overheard her on the phone. It was late, and I'd just come in from the garage after tinkering with my bike. The sound of Emily's hushed voice stopped me in my tracks as I stepped into the hallway. "I know," she said, her tone soft and almost playful. "He has no idea. It's perfect." I froze, my pulse quickening. Who was she talking to? What was she talking about? I stayed rooted to the spot, straining to catch the rest of the conversation, but Emily must have heard me. She abruptly ended the call and walked into the hallway, her expression guarded. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Just a friend," she said quickly, brushing past me. "Why? Is that a problem?" Her defensiveness caught me off guard. "No, I just—" "Don't start, Nick," she snapped, cutting me off. "I'm not in the mood." I stood there, speechless, as she disappeared into the bedroom and closed the door. Something was definitely wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was hiding something from me. Over the next few days, I began to notice more signs: texts she'd quickly hide, phone calls she'd step outside to take, and the way she seemed to be avoiding me altogether. My gut was screaming at me, but I pushed the thoughts aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, she was my wife. She wouldn't betray me like that. Would she? The gnawing suspicion wouldn't let go. Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of Emily's every move. It felt like I was living in a movie, one of those slow-burn psychological thrillers where the protagonist starts noticing cracks in the perfect veneer of their life. Except this wasn't a movie, it was my marriage. Emily's behavior was growing more erratic. She claimed to be busier than ever with work, but there were no late-night emails or case files strewn across the dining table like before. When I asked her about her cases, she waved me off with vague answers, as if she couldn't be bothered to pretend anymore. She'd slip out of the house for hours at a time, her excuses flimsy and unconvincing. "I'm just going to get coffee," she'd say, grabbing her bag and keys. 2 hours later, she'd return, claiming she'd bumped into a friend and lost track of time. The worst part? I didn't confront her. I couldn't. I was terrified of what I might hear if I did. Instead, I let the doubts fester, feeding on my silence like a parasite. One Friday night, Emily told me she had to stay late at work to prepare for a big client meeting. Her voice was so casual, so rehearsed, that it sent a chill down my spine. I nodded and kissed her goodbye, but as soon as the door closed behind her, I felt the dam inside me start to crack. I called Mike. My brother had always been my sounding board, the one person I could vent to without judgment. "Hey man," I said when he answered. "You got a minute?" "Of course," he replied, his voice warm and familiar. "What's up?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "It's Emily. She's been acting weird lately." Mike was quiet for a moment. "Weird how?" "She's distant. Secretive. Always out of the house. I don't know, maybe I'm just overthinking things, but—" I stopped, swallowing hard. "I think something's going on." "Nick, you know Emily," Mike said, his tone reassuring. "She's always been a little high-strung. It's probably just work stress." I wanted to believe him, but something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. His words were too smooth, too practiced. But I pushed the thought aside. Mike was my brother. He wouldn't lie to me. Would he? The next day, I decided to stop wondering and start finding answers. I felt sick to my stomach as I sat in my truck outside Emily's office, waiting to see if she'd really show up for her client meeting. Part of me hated myself for stooping to this level. Spying on my own wife? It felt wrong, but I couldn't shake the need to know the truth. Hours passed, and there was no sign of her. The parking lot remained eerily empty, the building dark. I clenched the steering wheel, my knuckles white. When she came home that evening, I was sitting on the couch, trying to act normal. She breezed in with a bright smile, as if she hadn't just spent the day lying to me. "How was work?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "Exhausting," she said, kicking off her heels. "But we got a lot done. Hopefully, next week will be less hectic." I nodded, biting back the dozen questions burning on my tongue. Instead, I reached out and took her hand, pulling her down onto the couch beside me. "Are we okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Of course we are. Why would you even ask that?" "I don't know," I said, searching her face for any sign of guilt. "You've just seemed distant lately. Like your mind's somewhere else." She hesitated, just for a moment, but it was long enough for me to notice. Then she plastered on a reassuring smile and leaned in to kiss me. "I'm sorry, babe," she said softly. "I've just been stressed with work. But everything's fine. I promise." Her words should have comforted me, but they didn't. They felt like a script, something she'd rehearsed. I wanted to believe her, but my gut was screaming at me that something was wrong. A week later, my suspicions were confirmed. It was Mike's birthday, and I'd planned to surprise him by showing up at his house unannounced with a bottle of his favorite bourbon. Mike and I had a tradition of spending his birthday together, just the two of us, reminiscing about old times and catching up. When I pulled into his driveway, I noticed Emily's car parked out front. My heart sank, and a wave of nausea rolled through me. Maybe she was here to drop off a gift, I told myself. Maybe she wanted to surprise him, too. But as I approached the front door, I heard voices coming from inside. Emily's laughter rang out, light and carefree in a way I hadn't heard in months. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Then I heard it, a low, guttural moan that sent ice through my veins. I stepped back, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. My mind raced, scrambling to find a rational explanation, but deep down, I already knew the truth. They were inside, and they weren't even trying to hide it. I stood on Mike's front porch, the faint sound of Emily's laughter and something else, a low, unmistakable rhythm, echoing in my ears. Time seemed to slow, my thoughts colliding into one another in a chaotic mess. My brain screamed at me to walk away, to leave before I saw something I couldn't unsee. But my feet wouldn't move. I felt frozen in place, rooted to the spot by a sick, morbid curiosity. I pressed my ear against the door, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. The sounds from inside were unmistakable now, breathy gasps, the squeak of furniture, Emily's voice whispering, "Oh God, yes!" The bourbon bottle slipped from my hand and shattered on the porch, sending shards of glass scattering at my feet. My body jolted back into motion, and without thinking, I reached for the doorknob. It turned easily in my hand. I pushed the door open. The scene in front of me was worse than I'd imagined. The living room was dimly lit, but I didn't need bright lights to see them. Emily was straddling Mike on his couch, her head thrown back, her dress bunched around her hips. My brother's hands gripped her thighs as he pulled her closer. They didn't even notice me at first. The world seemed to tilt, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. My chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of betrayal. I wanted to scream, to yell, to do something, anything, but all I could do was stand there, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Emily was the first to see me. Her eyes widened in horror, and she scrambled off Mike, tugging her dress down as if that would somehow undo what I'd just witnessed. "Nick!" she gasped, her voice trembling. This isn't what it looks like. What it looks like." I spat, my voice cracking. "Don't insult my intelligence, Emily." Mike stood up, his shirt unbuttoned, his face pale. "Nick, man, Shut up!" I roared, cutting him off. The sound of my own voice startled me. It was raw, animalistic, filled with more rage than I knew I was capable of. "You're my brother, Mike! How the fuck could you do this to me?" Mike took a step toward me, his hands raised in a placating gesture. I didn't mean for this to happen. It just happened." I laughed bitterly. "What, you tripped and fell into my wife?" Emily stepped between us, her hands outstretched. "Nick, please let me explain." I rounded on her, my vision blurring with tears. "Explain what, Emily? That you've been fucking my brother behind my back? That you've been lying to me for God knows how long? Go ahead, explain that." Tears streamed down her face, but I felt no sympathy, no pity, only cold, seething fury. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This way?" I repeated, my voice rising. "So what was the plan, huh? Keep sneaking around until I caught you? Or were you just waiting for the right moment to leave me for him?" "It's not like that," Emily said, shaking her head. "I still love you, Nick." Don't you dare say that to me," I growled, taking a step closer. "You don't get to claim you love me after what you've done. Love doesn't look like this, Emily. Love doesn't feel like this." Mike tried to intervene again, but I shoved him hard in the chest, sending him stumbling back onto the couch. "Stay the fuck out of this," I snapped. "You've done enough." For a moment, the room was silent, save for the sound of my ragged breathing. I looked between the two of them, my wife and my brother, and felt the full weight of their betrayal settle on my chest like a stone. "I hope it was worth it," I said finally, my voice trembling with emotion. "I hope whatever you two have is worth destroying our family for." "Nick, wait," Emily started, but I turned on my heel and walked out the door, slamming it behind me. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there, couldn't stand to be in the same room as them for another second. My vision blurred with tears as I stumbled to my truck, my hands shaking so badly that I fumbled with the keys. When I finally got the engine started, I drove aimlessly through the dark streets, my mind racing. Memories of my life with Emily played on an endless loop, each one tainted now by the knowledge of her betrayal. The laughter, the kisses, the promises we'd made, it all felt like a cruel joke. I pulled into an empty parking lot and slammed my fists against the steering wheel, letting out a guttural scream that echoed through the cab of the truck. How had I not seen this coming? How had I been so blind? The answer was simple: I trusted them. I trusted my wife. I trusted my brother. And they'd both betrayed me in the worst way imaginable. As I sat there in the darkness, the full weight of what I'd just witnessed began to sink in. This wasn't just some drunken mistake or a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice to betray me. And it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I spent the rest of that night sitting in my truck, parked under a flickering streetlight in an empty lot. My mind churned with anger, hurt, and disbelief, the events at Mike's house replaying over and over in my head. It felt surreal, like something ripped from a bad soap opera. But the ache in my chest told me it was all too real. By the time the sun started to rise, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. They thought they could humiliate me, ruin my life, and pretend like I didn't matter? No. They'd picked the wrong guy. First, I needed answers. I went home and showered, the water doing little to wash away the lingering nausea in my stomach. My mind was already planning my next move as I got dressed, throwing on a simple pair of jeans and a black t-shirt. Then I grabbed my laptop, opened it on the kitchen counter, and got to work. The first step was checking Emily's phone records. We shared a family plan, and though I'd never bothered to snoop before, I had no hesitation now. I logged into the account, scrolling through her call history and text logs. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Mike's number appeared over and over again, far more than I'd ever noticed before. Late-night calls, long strings of text messages, hell, there were even photos sent back and forth. My heart pounded in my chest as I clicked through the data. The timestamps painted a damning picture. The calls and texts started months ago, right around the time Emily had started dressing up more and working late. My brother had been a constant presence in her life long before I caught them in the act. I clenched my fists, feeling a surge of rage. How long had they been laughing at me behind my back? How long had they been sneaking around, thinking I'd never catch on? I couldn't stop there. I needed proof, something undeniable, something I could throw in their faces when the time came. That's when I made the decision to call a private investigator. By the end of the week, the PI, a no-nonsense woman named Sandra, had more than enough evidence to confirm what I already knew. She handed me a manila folder thick with photos, emails, and other damning pieces of evidence. "They're not exactly discreet," Sandra said as she slid the folder across the table in her small office. "Your wife has been meeting your brother at his place, hotels, even your own goddamn house when you're at work." That last detail hit me like a punch to the gut. My house. The thought of them desecrating the one place that had always felt like my sanctuary made my skin crawl. "Anything else?" I asked, my voice tight. Sandra hesitated, then pulled out a smaller envelope. "I wasn't sure if I should bring this up, but you need to know." I took the envelope from her, my hands trembling as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, a printout from a pregnancy test website. "Your wife bought that last month," Sandra said quietly. "And before you ask, yes, there's a strong possibility it's not yours." I stared at the paper, my vision blurring with rage. It wasn't enough for them to betray me. They had to destroy me, too. "I don't even know what to say," I muttered, my voice barely audible. Sandra gave me a sympathetic look. "Look, I know this isn't easy, but you've got options. You've got evidence. If you want to file for divorce, you'll be in a strong position. And if you want to take them both to court for alienation of affection, I can refer you to a lawyer who specializes in cases like this." I nodded numbly, tucking the envelope into my jacket. "Thanks, Sandra. I'll be in touch. As I walked out of her office, my mind was racing. I knew I couldn't let them walk away unscathed, but I wasn't sure how far I was willing to go. Divorce was the obvious choice, but it didn't feel like enough. Not after everything they'd done to me. No, I needed them to feel what I was feeling. That night, Emily came home like nothing was wrong. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and asked how my day was, her smile as bright and fake as ever. Fine, I said curtly, watching her as she moved around the kitchen. I wanted to scream at her, to throw the photos and emails in her face, but I forced myself to stay calm. Mike called earlier, she said casually, pouring herself a glass of wine. He said he might stop by this weekend. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my tone even. Oh, really? What for? Something about fixing his grill. You know how he is. Yeah, I muttered. I know exactly how he is. Emily didn't seem to notice the edge in my voice. She took her glass of wine into the living room and curled up on the couch, her phone already in hand. I stood in the kitchen, watching her from the corner of my eye. She looked so comfortable, so smug, as if she had nothing to hide. It made my blood boil. But I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I had everything lined up. I spent the next few days preparing, gathering every piece of evidence I could find. When the moment came, I wanted it to be devastating. They thought they'd gotten away with it, that I'd never find out. But they had no idea what was coming. The weekend came, and with it, Mike's visit. By then, I had everything I needed, the photos, the texts, the receipts, and Sandra's summary of their affair. The pregnancy angle was the final dagger, but I kept that revelation close to my chest for now. I wanted them to squirm before I dropped the nuclear bomb. Emily had been oddly chipper that morning, as if she were trying to compensate for the unspoken tension between us. She hummed to herself as she cooked breakfast, her carefree demeanor fueling the fire inside me. I played along, keeping my face neutral, my responses short. Mike showed up around noon, grinning like he didn't have a care in the world. Seeing him standing there on my porch, acting like nothing had happened, made me want to slam the door in his face. Instead, I stepped aside and let him in. "Nick," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "How's it going, man?" "Couldn't be better," I replied, forcing a tight smile. Emily appeared from the kitchen, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Mike! I didn't know you'd be here so soon." Her voice was warm, almost giddy, and it took everything in me not to grab her by the arm and throw her lies back in her face. "Figured I'd get an early start on that grill," Mike said, shooting her a quick wink. I saw it. She saw it. Did they even care that I was standing right there? "Let's get started then," I said, my tone clipped. Mike followed me out to the backyard, and we set to work dismantling the grill. The whole time, I kept glancing at him, wondering how the hell he could look me in the eye after what he'd done. "So, what's been going on with you lately?" I asked, feigning casual interest. Mike shrugged. Same old, same old. Work's been busy. You know how it is." "Yeah, I bet," I said. "And Emily? You two seem to be spending a lot of time together these days." Mike froze, his hand stilling on the wrench he was holding. "What do you mean?" I turned to him, my face unreadable. "I mean, she's been really busy with things. Thought maybe you know more about it than I do." He laughed nervously, avoiding my gaze. "Nah, I don't know anything about that." "Right." I nodded slowly. "Of course you don't." The tension between us was thick enough to cut with a knife, but before I could press him further, Emily appeared on the deck. "Do you guys need anything?" she called, her voice sweet and cheerful. "Nope," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Mike. "We're good." That evening, I decided it was time. I couldn't keep playing this charade, pretending everything was fine while they continued to treat me like a fool. I waited until dinner, setting the table myself, and insisting we eat together. Emily raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, and Mike followed her lead, sitting across from me like we were just one big happy family. The conversation was stilted at first, mostly small talk about work and mutual acquaintances. But as we finished eating, I cleared my throat and leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest. "So," I began, my voice calm but deliberate, "there's something I've been meaning to talk to you both about." Emily and Mike exchanged a glance, their smiles faltering. "What is it, babe?" Emily asked, her tone cautious. I reached under the table and pulled out the manila folder Sandra had given me. I slapped it onto the table and slid it toward them, my eyes never leaving their faces. "Go ahead," I said. "Take a look." Emily's hand trembled as she opened the folder, her face blanching as she flipped through the photos and documents. Mike leaned over, his expression darkening with each passing second. "What the hell is this?" Mike asked, his voice shaking. "This," I said, my tone icy, "is proof of what you two have been doing behind my back." Emily's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her eyes darting between me and the incriminating evidence in front of her. "Nick, I can explain," she stammered. "Oh, I'd love to hear it," I said, leaning forward. "Explain to me how you thought fucking my brother was a good idea. Explain how you thought I'd never find out." Mike stood abruptly, knocking over his chair in the process. "Nick, calm down. Don't you dare tell me to calm down," I roared, slamming my fist on the table. "You're my brother, Mike. You were supposed to have my back, not stab me in it." Emily started crying, her sobs grating against my ears. "I'm sorry, Nick. I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" I said, laughing bitterly. "You're sorry? That's all you've got?" She reached for my hand, but I pulled away, disgusted. "Nick, it didn't mean anything. It was a mistake." "Mistake?" I snapped. "Mistakes don't last for months, Emily. Mistakes don't involve buying pregnancy tests." Her eyes widened in shock, and Mike's face turned a shade paler. "That's right," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I know everything. And I'm done. You two deserve each other." I stood, grabbing the folder and heading for the door. Emily's cries followed me, but I didn't look back. As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't the clueless husband or the trusting brother. I was in control, and I wasn't going to let them take that from me. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I left the house that night, driving aimlessly through the darkened streets as Emily's sobs and Mike's pathetic excuses echoed in my head. I knew I couldn't just let this end with a confrontation. No, they needed to feel the weight of what they'd done, and I wasn't about to walk away quietly. By the time I pulled into an empty parking lot on the outskirts of town, I had a plan forming in my mind. It wasn't enough to leave Emily. It wasn't enough to sever ties with Mike. I wanted them to lose what mattered most. I parked my truck, the engine still running, and reached for my phone. The first call I made was to Sandra, my private investigator. "Sandra, it's Nick," I said when she answered. "I need one more favor." "Of course," she replied, her tone cautious. "What's going on?" I explained the situation, laying out every ugly detail about Mike, Emily, and the pregnancy test. By the time I finished, Sandra was silent for a long moment. "Nick," she finally said, "are you sure about this? You're heading into dangerous territory." "I've never been more sure of anything," I replied, my voice cold and steady. "Can you do it or not?" She sighed. "I can. But I hope you know what you're doing." The next few weeks were a blur of calculated moves and quiet revenge. While Emily and Mike scrambled to figure out what to do next, I stayed several steps ahead of them. First, I filed for divorce, citing adultery as the reason. In our state, that meant I had the upper hand when it came to dividing assets. The evidence Sandra had gathered ensured that Emily wouldn't get a dime more than she was entitled to, and even that felt like too much. Next, I reached out to Mike's boss. He worked at a mid-level financial firm, and I knew his reputation was crucial to his success. Sandra had unearthed some shady dealings Mike had been involved in, including siphoning funds from the firm for personal expenses. It wasn't illegal, at least not yet, but it was enough to put him on thin ice with his employer. I sent the information anonymously, attaching a note that read, "Thought you should know who you're trusting with your money." By the time I was done, Mike's career was hanging by a thread. As for Emily, I didn't stop with the divorce papers. I made sure everyone in our circle of friends and family knew the truth. I didn't embellish or exaggerate, I didn't have to. The raw facts were enough to destroy her carefully cultivated image of perfection. She tried to control the narrative, of course, playing the victim and claiming I was overreacting to a mistake. But the evidence spoke for itself. The photos, the texts, the hotel receipts, it all painted a damning picture. Her parents called me, begging me to reconsider, but I shut them down quickly. "Your daughter made her choice," I told them. "She knew what she was doing every step of the way. Now she gets to live with the consequences." I could tell they didn't know how to respond to that, and frankly, I didn't care. The final blow came when Emily tried to reach out to me directly. She showed up at my temporary apartment one evening, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Nick, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I know I messed up, but can't we just talk? Can't we try to fix this?" I stared at her, my expression cold and unyielding. "Fix what, Emily? You mean the marriage you destroyed? The life we built together that you threw away for a few nights with my brother?" She flinched, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't like that. I still love you." "Don't," I snapped, my voice sharp. "Don't you dare stand there and tell me you love me. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. If you loved me, you wouldn't have lied to my face every single day." She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. "You made your bed, Emily," I said, my tone final. "Now lie in it." I closed the door in her face, locking it with a satisfying click. As the weeks turned into months, the fallout from my actions began to settle. Emily moved out of the house, forced to downsize into a small apartment, while she tried to rebuild her life. Mike, meanwhile, lost his job after his boss uncovered more financial discrepancies. He'd always been good at making friends, but even his charm couldn't save him this time. And the pregnancy? Emily called me one last time to confirm what I already suspected. "It's his," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Mike's." I hung up without a word, the final thread of my connection to her severed. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. For years, I'd been the loyal husband and the trusting brother, blind to the cracks forming beneath the surface. But now, I was the one who'd walked away with my dignity intact, while they were left to pick up the pieces of their ruined lives. It wasn't a happy ending, not by a long shot. But it was justice. And for now, that was enough. Months had passed since I'd walked out of Mike's house that night, since I'd taken the first step in dismantling the lives of the two people I once held closest to me. I thought I'd feel satisfaction, maybe even relief, but all I felt was emptiness. Revenge hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't filled the void their betrayal had carved out of me. It hadn't brought back the life I'd lost. The divorce was finalized in record time. Emily didn't fight it, she couldn't. The evidence I'd gathered made her case indefensible. She got a fraction of the assets she'd likely hoped for, enough to scrape by but nowhere near enough to live comfortably. The house was mine, the car was mine, and every financial advantage we'd built together now belonged solely to me. Mike had fallen even harder. After he lost his job, word of his personal indiscretions started to spread. Our social circle was smaller than I realized, and news of his affair with Emily, and the baby she was carrying, made the rounds like wildfire. His friends disappeared. His reputation was in tatters. I heard through the grapevine that he moved in with Emily, but their so-called fresh start didn't seem to be going well. A friend who still had ties to both of them told me Mike had been drinking heavily, and Emily had taken to sleeping on the couch most nights. "The honeymoon phase didn't last long," the friend had said with a bitter laugh. Good. They deserved each other. But even as I watched their lives crumble, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd lost something I could never get back. It wasn't just Emily or Mike, It was the version of myself that believed in trust, in love, in the idea that people would do right by you if you did right by them. That version of me was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, and far more cynical. One night, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of me and Emily from the early days of our relationship, smiling and carefree. Pictures of me and Mike as kids, building tree houses and playing in the dirt. The memories felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who'd lived a completely different life. I tossed my phone onto the couch and poured myself a drink. The whiskey burned as it went down, but it wasn't enough to numb the ache in my chest. For the first time since this all began, I allowed myself to grieve, not just for the life I'd lost, but for the person I used to be. As the weeks turned into months, I tried to rebuild. I threw myself into my work, taking on extra projects, and working longer hours to keep my mind occupied. I started hitting the gym, channeling my anger into something productive. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the loneliness that crept in when the day was done and the house was silent. One evening, I got a call from my mother. I hadn't spoken to her much since everything went down. Explaining what had happened was too painful, and I wasn't ready to face her disappointment in Mike, or the pity she'd undoubtedly feel for me. "Hi, Mom," I said, forcing a smile she couldn't see. "Hi, honey," she replied, her voice warm but cautious. "I've been thinking about you. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I said automatically. She didn't buy it. "Nick, don't do that. Don't shut me out." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I'm getting through it. That's the best I can say right now." We talked for a while, mostly about nothing. She told me about the garden she'd been working on, and I told her about a project I'd been overseeing at work. It was nice, even comforting, but I could tell there was something else she wanted to say. "Mike called me," she said finally, her voice hesitant. I stiffened. "Oh, yeah? What did he want?" "He said he wants to talk to you. He sounded desperate." I let out a bitter laugh. "Desperate for what? My forgiveness? He can forget it." "Nick," she said softly, "he's still your brother." "No," I said firmly. "He stopped being my brother the moment he decided to sleep with my wife." There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was heavy with sadness. "I just hate seeing my family fall apart like this." I didn't have the heart to tell her it was already broken beyond repair. A few days later, I got a message from Mike. It was short, just a few sentences, but it was enough to reignite my anger. "Nick, I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to talk to you. Please." I deleted the message without responding. But he didn't stop there. Over the next week, he called me 3 times and left increasingly desperate voicemails, each one more pathetic than the last. "Nick, please. I need to explain. I need you to understand. Nick, it's killing me that we're like this. I know I don't have the right to ask, but can we just talk? Nick, please. I can't keep living like this." I listened to each one, my chest tightening with every word, but I never called him back. What was there to say? Then one night, I got a call from Emily. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice flat. She hesitated, her voice trembling. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." I laughed bitterly. "A little late for that, don't you think?" "I know," she said, her tone desperate. "But I mean it. I ruined everything, Nick. I ruined you. And I hate myself for it." I wanted to tell her I hated her too. I wanted to scream at her, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. But instead I just said, "Good," and hung up. The emptiness inside me didn't go away after that call. If anything, it felt bigger, deeper, like it would swallow me whole if I let it. But I wasn't going to let it. I'd survived their betrayal. I'd rebuilt my life from the ground up. And I wasn't going to let their guilt, their regrets, or their apologies drag me back down. I didn't owe them anything. The next few weeks passed in a blur. My days were filled with work, gym sessions, and the occasional beer with coworkers, but my nights were a battlefield. Sleep was a fickle thing, refusing to come when I needed it, and hitting me like a freight train when I didn't. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling through memories of Emily, Mike, and everything they'd destroyed. I hadn't heard from either of them since Emily's call, which suited me just fine. I didn't want their apologies, their guilt, or their attempts to rebuild something that couldn't be salvaged. But that silence didn't last. One rainy Saturday morning, as I was sipping coffee and scrolling through emails, there was a knock at my door. My stomach tightened, a sinking feeling washing over me. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Mike stood there, drenched from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked like hell, hollow-eyed, unshaven, and thinner than I remembered. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. "Nick," he said, his voice cracking. "Can we talk?" I clenched my jaw, gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles turned white. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Please," he said, his eyes pleading. "Just give me 5 minutes." Every instinct in me screamed to slam the door in his face, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the faint, lingering thread of the brother I used to love. Either way, I stepped aside and let him in. He stood awkwardly in the living room, dripping water onto the floor. I didn't offer him a towel or ask him to sit. Instead, I crossed my arms and stared at him, waiting. "Well?" I said sharply. Mike swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Nick, I don't even know where to start. I know I screwed up. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I need you to hear me out." "Unforgivable," I echoed, my voice cold. "That's the first honest thing you've said in months." He flinched, but he didn't back down. "It wasn't supposed to happen, okay? It started. I don't even know how it started. We got too close, and then one night, it just happened." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You're really trying to sell this as an accident? You expect me to believe you just fell into my wife's bed? Come on, Mike. Give me some credit. It wasn't like that," he said desperately. He trailed off, his shoulders slumping. "Save it," I snapped. "I don't care how it happened. The fact is, it did. You made your choice, Mike. Both of you did." "I know," he said quietly. "And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But, Nick, I miss you. I miss my brother." Those words hit harder than I expected, but I didn't let it show. I kept my expression cold, my tone sharp. "You miss me? You have a funny way of showing it. You didn't seem to miss me when you were sneaking around with Emily." His face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought he might cry. "I'm sorry, Nick. I don't know what else to say. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. I needed you to know that it's killing me, what I've done, what I've lost." I stared at him, my emotions a swirling mess of anger, sadness, and something I couldn't quite name. "Good," I said finally. "You should feel like shit. You should hate yourself every single day, the same way I hate you." He nodded, his head hanging low. "I do. Believe me, I do." For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the only sound the rain tapping against the windows. "Is that all?" I asked eventually. Mike looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "Yeah. That's all." I opened the door and gestured for him to leave. "Then we're done here." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but the look on my face must have convinced him otherwise. Without another word, he stepped out into the rain and walked away. I watched him go, my chest tight with a mix of anger and grief. Part of me wanted to believe he was genuine, that his regret was real. But the scars he'd left were too deep, the wounds too raw. I closed the door and locked it, leaning against the frame as the weight of the encounter settled over me. He'd apologized. He'd admitted he was wrong. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The days that followed were quieter. Mike didn't call, and neither did Emily. It felt like a stalemate, A fragile ceasefire where none of us dared make the next move. But even in that silence, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Life had taken on a strange kind of rhythm. The chaos of the confrontation, the divorce, and the fallout had left my world in ruins, but I'd somehow managed to rebuild a semblance of stability. Work kept me grounded, the gym kept me distracted, and my apartment, though small and far from what I'd once called home, felt like a place I could start over. But the peace was fragile, and I could feel cracks forming beneath the surface. It came to a head one afternoon when I got an unexpected call from Sandra, my private investigator. I hadn't spoken to her since she'd given me the evidence against Emily and Mike, and her name flashing on my phone immediately set my nerves on edge. "Sandra?" I answered cautiously. "Nick," she said, her tone clipped and professional. "I thought you'd want to know about this. I wasn't actively looking into anything, but something came across my desk that I think you should be aware of." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Emily's pregnant. Farther along than we initially thought." And what?" I pressed, my voice sharp. "And she's been telling people the baby might be yours." The words hit me like a freight train, leaving me momentarily speechless. "What?" I finally managed to choke out. "I don't know the full story," Sandra continued, "but I have it on good authority that she's been planting the idea that you're the father. It's messy, Nick. I thought you should know before it blindsides you." I ran a hand through my hair, trying to process what I'd just heard. "She knows it's Mike's," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "She admitted it." Sandra sighed. "I don't doubt that she knows. But for whatever reason, she's spinning a different narrative now. You need to be prepared, Nick. This could get ugly." "Ugly?" I laughed bitterly. "It's already a fucking disaster." That evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at a bottle of whiskey on the coffee table. I hadn't opened it yet, but the temptation was strong. My mind raced with questions. Why would Emily lie about the baby? What was she hoping to gain? Was this some kind of twisted attempt to pull me back into her orbit? The next day, I called my lawyer. "Nick, we need to nip this in the bud," he said after I explained the situation. "If she's telling people the baby might be yours, we need to demand a paternity test as soon as the child is born." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "Do whatever it takes. I'm not going to let her drag me through the mud with this." A week later, Emily called. "Nick," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "Can we talk?" "What do you want, Emily?" I asked, keeping my tone cold. I wanted to clear the air," she said. "I know you've probably heard things." "Oh, you mean the part where you're telling people your baby might be mine?" I interrupted, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Yeah, I've heard." She hesitated, her breath hitching. "It's not what you think." "Then enlighten me," I said sharply. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I didn't mean for it to get out of hand. I didn't want people to judge me, okay? Everyone's already looking at me like I'm some kind of monster. I thought if they thought it might be yours, they'd go easier on me." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So what? You decided to drag my name through the dirt to save face? You're unbelievable, Emily." "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said weakly. I laughed bitterly. "Didn't mean to hurt me? Emily, you've done nothing but hurt me since this whole thing started. And now you're trying to pin Mike's kid on me to make yourself look better? Do you even hear yourself?" "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know what else to do." "You know what you can do," I said, my voice cold. "You can stop lying. You can own up to what you've done and leave me the hell out of it." "I will," she said quickly. "I promise. I'll tell everyone the truth. Just please don't hate me. It's too late for that," I said, and I hung up. True to her word, Emily backtracked on her claims, but the damage had already been done. Rumors had spread, and I found myself fielding uncomfortable questions from coworkers, friends, and even family. "I heard you might be having a baby," one colleague said with a knowing smile. Do you think it's really yours? A friend asked bluntly over drinks. Even my mom called, her voice full of worry. Nick, is there any chance? No. I cut her off. There's no chance. It's Mike's, and she knows it. By the time the baby was born, I was drained. The drama, the rumors, the constant barrage of questions, it had all taken its toll. But I wasn't about to let Emily or Mike drag me into their mess any further. I demanded a paternity test the day after the baby was born, and the results came back exactly as I expected. Not mine. I didn't call Emily or Mike to gloat. I didn't feel the need to. The truth was enough. As the weeks turned into months, I began to rebuild again. The wounds were still there, raw and ugly, but I'd learned to live with them. Emily and Mike were no longer my concern. They had their baby, a daughter, I heard through the grapevine. I hoped for the child's sake that they managed to hold it together, though I doubted it. They'd built their relationship on lies and betrayal, and I knew firsthand how unstable that foundation was. As for me, I was done with them. I'd cut the cord, severed the ties, and walked away. It wasn't the ending I'd wanted, but it was the one I'd been dealt. And for now, that was enough. The months turned into a year, and for the first time since the nightmare began, I started to feel something resembling peace. The chaos Emily and Mike had unleashed on my life had finally subsided, leaving behind a quiet emptiness that I was learning to embrace. They were out of my life for good now. I'd made sure of that. My lawyer ensured the divorce was airtight, and the paternity test results were my final connection to Emily's drama. Mike had tried reaching out a few more times, texts, calls, even a handwritten letter, but I ignored every attempt. Whatever relationship we'd had as brothers was dead, buried beneath the weight of his betrayal. As for Emily, I heard snippets of her life through mutual friends and the occasional run-in with people who still talked to her. She and Mike were still together, raising their daughter in the shadow of their shame. From what I gathered, their relationship was strained, full of fights and resentment. Part of me felt satisfaction at their misery. Another part, the part one hated to admit existed, felt sorry for the kid who'd been born into their mess. I threw myself into rebuilding my life. Work became my anchor, a way to keep my mind busy and my hands occupied. I started taking on bigger projects, earning promotions and raises that I once would have celebrated with Emily. Now, I kept the victories to myself. I moved into a new apartment, one that didn't hold the ghosts of my old life. It was small but comfortable, with big windows that let in plenty of light. I filled it with things that made me happy, books, records, art pieces I'd always liked but never bought because Emily had hated them. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like myself again. Or maybe I was becoming someone new, someone harder, smarter, and less trusting. One evening, I was at a bar with some coworkers, celebrating the successful completion of a major project. The drinks were flowing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely relaxed. You know, Nick, one of my coworkers said, clapping me on the back, you're a hell of a lot more fun now than you used to be. What changed? I laughed, the sound bitter even to my own ears. Life, I said simply. He didn't press, and I didn't elaborate. The real turning point came when I ran into an old friend at the gym. Her name was Sarah, and we'd gone to college together before losing touch over the years. She was the kind of person who radiated positivity, with an infectious laugh and a sharp wit that had always made her a magnet for people. Nick? She said, her eyes lighting up when she saw me. Is that you? I nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Sarah. Wow. It's been a while. We caught up over coffee, trading stories about our lives since college. I told her about my job, carefully skirting around the mess with Emily and Mike. She told me about her work as a graphic designer and her recent move back to the city. It felt good to talk to someone who wasn't wrapped up in the drama of my past. Over the next few months, Sarah and I started hanging out more. At first, it was casual, coffee here, a drink there, but it quickly turned into something more. She was easy to be around, her energy a stark contrast to the suffocating weight I'd been carrying for so long. She didn't pry into my past, though I could tell she was curious. Eventually, I told her everything, about Emily, about Mike, about the betrayal that had shattered my life. Her reaction surprised me. "Nick," she said softly, her hand resting on mine. "What they did to you was horrible. But it doesn't define you. You're not just the guy who got screwed over. You're so much more than that." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so long defining myself by what I'd lost that I hadn't stopped to think about what I still had, or what I could build moving forward. With Sarah's encouragement, I started letting go of the anger I'd been holding on to. It wasn't easy, and some days it felt impossible, but I was tired of letting Emily and Mike live rent-free in my head. One day, I got a message from a mutual friend who still kept tabs on them. "Mike and Emily are splitting up," the message read. "Guess they couldn't make it work after all." I stared at the words for a long time, waiting for the surge of satisfaction that had always accompanied news of their misery. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt nothing. I deleted the message and went back to what I'd been doing. Life didn't magically get better overnight, but it did get better. I found joy in small things: a sunny day, a good book, a laugh shared with Sarah. I started to feel like the version of myself I thought I'd lost, but stronger, wiser, and more resilient. Emily and Mike became ghosts of a life I no longer lived, their betrayal a scar that reminded me of what I'd survived. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The story didn't have a happy ending. There were no grand reconciliations, no fairy tale resolutions. But it had an ending, and that was enough. Sometimes survival is the only victory you need.